I will always be there to support my colleagues who seek to challenge unfair practices. But as for me, being on the front line, I'm done.
Name your price in the beginning. If it ever gets more expensive than the price you name, get out of there.
When is enough enough? For me, it was a revealing discussion with my fellow educators that showed me the path ahead. The discussion started rather innocently. We talked about how we could improve the experience of learning for our students. Perhaps misjudging the air of camaraderie, I suggested the need to provide more context to our students. Often, we transmit ideas to students without discussing how these ideas were developed. This is a significant issue. If we as educators do not show how these ideas were developed, many students believe that these ideas are neutral, these ideas are objective, and even universal. This is not the case. Ideas are developed in particular regions, by particular people, for particular purposes. We must inform students that many of these so-called universal ideas were developed by European property-owning men who often held erroneous views about the working classes, women, and people of color. Moreover, their ideas were not meant to benefit the working classes, women, and people of color. Some authors have even argued that their ideas harmed and continue to harm the working classes, women, and people of color. Our job as educators should be to expose the true context of these ideas, not to eradicate these ideas, just expose their context. Without even knowing it, my fellow educators saw this as a step too far. I had triggered whiteness, an avalanche of whiteness. My fellow educators instantly went into defensive mode. This is a step too far. Should we scrap everything? Should we do away with all the great European works because we may hurt somebody's feelings? Should we stop listening to the compositions of Wagner? Wagner? I did not even know who that was. Apparently, he wasn't a fan of the Jewish people or miscegenation. Nonetheless, I was utterly confused. I said something very specific and measured, but all of their responses were emotive and generic. I did not understand this until I recalled a lecture by Christopher Hitchens. This lecture was just before he turned to the dark side.
I was very impressed by the torrent of bad faith in which I was immediately doused. By their arguments, ladies and gentlemen, you may know them. When people begin to introduce the irrelevant and the non sequitur and the generalization, you know you're onto something. For example, people say, do you mean that every artifact in every museum in Europe should immediately be returned to its country of origin? I think you can tell that that was not what I was saying. But could I get anyone to get off that song? I don't think I could. Do you see the analogy, perhaps, to what we're meant to discuss this evening? I think perhaps you might. There's a constant whine and drone, what I call a white whine, when this subject comes up. People say, what do you mean we'd have to go back and help the Comanches get there? You know how it goes.
I had been forced to drink what Hitchens called the white wine, and it was bitter. The servers of this wine were supposed to be my anti-racist allies. It was supposed to be a measured and cordial conversation, but it turned into something else very quickly. It was at that moment that I said to myself, I'm done. I felt the pull of the conveyor belt. Tatum uses the conveyor belt as a metaphor. The belt moves in a direction that benefits the dominant group. Whether one is standing, walking, or running, the conveyor belt will move in this one direction. You may not even notice that the conveyor belt is moving in this one direction until you try to move in the opposite direction. Then you will instantly feel the force of the conveyor belt that compels everyone to acquiesce willingly or unwillingly to its forward momentum. So Tatum states that to resist the conveyor belt, you have to run twice as fast in the opposite direction. I have no desire to run twice as fast in the opposite direction. Thus, regretfully, I withdraw. I will always be there to support my colleagues who seek to challenge unfair practices. But as for me, being on the front line, I'm done.